Good evening. My name is Penny Heipel, and I am a senior at Hillsdale, majoring in history. It is my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Michael Barone. Michael Barone is a Fox News contributor and senior writer for U.S. News and World Report. A native of Highland Park, Michigan, he received his A.B. from Harvard University and his LL.B. from Yale Law School. Mr. Barone is a former member of the editorial page staff of The Washington Post and has written for many publications, including The Economist, The New York Times, The Detroit News, The American Spectator, American Enterprise, The Times Literary Supplement, and The Daily Telegraph of London. For many years, he was the chief co-author of the Almanac of American Politics, a publication which he founded. He is the author of numerous books, including Hard America, Soft America, Competition versus Coddling and the Battle for the Future of the Nation, The New Americans, How the Melting Pot Can Work Again, and Our Country, The Shaping of America from Roosevelt to Reagan. Please join me in welcoming Michael Barone.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here back in my native state of Michigan. I should add to that introduction that I'm now senior political analyst. I'm not sure that I like the senior part of that title at the Washington Examiner, and I urge you to look up my stuff on WashingtonExaminer.com and that of my many good colleagues, Brian York, Tim Carney, many others, and so forth. As the student mentioned, I am the graduate of a university that may become known in good time as the Hillsdale of the East, a place called Harvard, and so forth, if they straighten themselves out on some of their ideological things. I have had a career in some ways that's been kind of a checkered career. I did go to Yale Law School, which I thought was next best thing to no law school at all. But I found that I've gone from one profession to another, each one of which tends to pay less than the one before, and to have a lower standard of intellectual content and integrity. So I started off with the law, fairly high profession in regard to intellectual content and integrity. And then I went down a step or two to political consultants. I mean, political consultants are not the most biased people in the business, because if you keep getting things wrong, you won't get any clients anymore. There's a sort of profit principle there, as there is in free enterprise. On the other hand, if you're a political journalist, and that was my next profession, journalism, there's no penalty for being wrong. There may be considerable rewards for it. In any case, I go there, and obviously there's only one step more that I can go down the downward path, and that's to standard academia. So I haven't made that jump yet. I get a little scared when I look down to the depths of that and so forth. But I do try to dabble in trying to learn more history, and I've been doing an exercise that I recommend that my friend Paul Ray and the faculty here read the Federalist Papers in order. Read Hamilton's papers first, and then read all of Madison's, or go back and forth instead of mixing them up, seeing how you can draw out what different issues they're interested in, how their minds are working differently, and get clues to why those two collaborators on that project in 1787 and 88 become political adversaries and enemies in 1790 and 1791. Anyway, that's the kind of things that I like to get interested in when I want to turn my attention away from political journalism. So I've been honored to be asked to participate in the Hillsdale series on presidential elections. I noticed that most of the elections are results which many here at Hillsdale consider to be dismal results from the elections in different ways. And they've asked me to speak about the election of 1876. And my questions, I started off, an interesting exercise to ask people on the street, what presidential election in American history had the highest turnout ever, highest voter turnout as a percentage of eligibles? And what presidential election was decided not in the forums mentioned in the Constitution, not in the Electoral College, not in the House of Representatives, where the election of 1800 was decided in 1824, but by an appointed commission that was set up by Congress. And of course, the answer to both questions is the election of 1876. And the names of the two major party candidates, forgotten. How many people here know a lot about Samuel J. Tilden? I know Roger Kimball, I was talking about here earlier in this presentation, knows that his mansion in New York's Gramercy Park is now the Arts Club of New York, very elegant place, rich man. Rutherford B. Hayes, how many knows about Rutherford? I think you may know about his wife, who was known as Lemonade Lucy because she refused to serve alcoholic beverages in the White House. What I didn't realize until I read up on this election was that the outgoing First Lady, Mrs. Ulysses S. Grant, left several cases of bourbon whiskey in the White House for Mrs. Hayes to use if she wanted to in things, and I gathered that they must have lasted 4 years until the next administration came in. In any case, the election of 1876 has largely been forgotten. The issues at stake in many ways have long been settled. But I think for those who want to understand the long course of American history and some of the tragic elements and some of the triumphant elements in it, and to understand how certain presidential elections have results that can reverberate for years and decades afterwards, not just in our politics, but in our larger culture. A knowledge of the election of 1876 is essential. Let me state the basic facts about this election and then make three major points about its significance. Some of the familiar features of our current political process were already in place. The Democratic and Republican parties had been around in 1876 for 44 and 22 years. They held their 12th and 6th national conventions to nominate presidential candidates. They now have held 92 national conventions between them, of which I have attended in one way, shape, or form 24. I think with the virtual convention, it's going to be a little difficult to attend in the future, but that's my record. And those two parties were competing in their 6th general election. All this, by the way, was utterly different from the process that Alexander Hamilton describes in the Federalist Papers. Hamilton gets a lot of things right about the early republic and how policy would be developed. He did much of that policy making himself, but he really thought that the electors would meet separately in their states, that they would choose local prominent people, and that the House of Representatives would routinely choose among the people, that nobody would get a majority in the Electoral College and so forth. That's the way the Constitution was written. Didn't work out that way. And it didn't work out because we had those political parties in operation in partisan politics, which the framers and founders said that they disliked, but which in fact comes in under the Constitution in the 1790s. And Hamilton and Madison, the authors of almost all the Federalist Papers, are two of the competing forces. Of course, the 1876 election came 11 years after the end of the Civil War. And the great issue of the time was Reconstruction, the enforcement of equal rights for blacks in the states in the South. And President Ulysses S. Grant, elected in 1868 and 1872, the victorious Union general, had sent federal troops to enforce equal rights in many southern states against really kind of hideous violence that was practiced by people that opposed black equal rights and by the nascent Ku Klux Klan that was founded by a former Confederate general. But the Democratic House of Representatives, majority elected in the 1874 election cycle, opposed all such measures, and there were troops remaining in only 3 states. In a decade that saw technological progress symbolized by the telephone and the electric light. There were serious economic issues as well. There had been a major economic downturn, the so-called Panic of 1873, that had created a lot of unemployment and economic ruction. Grant had started the process of withdrawing the greenbacks, the inflationary currency issued to partially finance the Civil War, and installing hard money. That was in process, but it hadn't been completed yet. He kept in place the high tariffs voted by the Republican majorities after the Southerners seceded and left Congress in 1861. The Democrats, after their big congressional victory 2 years before, were confident of victory, and they nominated Samuel Tilden, the governor of New York, who had defeated Boss Tweed and Tammany Hall, a millionaire railroad investor who lived in the mansion on Gramercy Park, as I mentioned, and who was a highly intelligent and able man. The Republicans were split between rivals. You had multiple supporters of Grant's Reconstruction policy, the so-called stalwarts. They ran against each other in the Republican convention, Oliver H.P. Morton and Roscoe Conkling. You had James G. Blaine, who was known as a half-breed. He wasn't quite as strong a Reconstructionist who'd been Speaker of the House. You had other candidates. Only on the 7th ballot did they nominate a relative dark horse, Rutherford B. Hayes, a former Union general elected the previous year as governor of Ohio. Note, by the way, the home states of the nominees. New York and Ohio were the third largest states. They were marginal in just about every presidential election. They cast an outsized percentage of the electoral votes, and of course, the parties kept nominating again and again candidates for president and vice president who were from New York and Ohio and the fifth largest state, which was also marginal, Indiana. They kept appearing all the time because the thought was any little local advantage they might have in their state or county could make the difference in what were pretty close elections. Tilden carried New York by 3%. That was a pretty large margin. New York was a very closely split marginal state in the elections of this whole period. He led in popular votes with 50.9%, rounded off 51%. By the way, that was the highest percentage for any Democratic candidate in the 100 years between Andrew Jackson and Franklin Roosevelt. No Democrat got higher than 51% of the popular vote during that 100 years. But in 3 states where the federal troops remained, South Carolina, which had a black majority, Florida and Louisiana, 2 sets of electors were reported to Congress, one for each party, and there was an additional dispute over an elector in Oregon. This left Tilden with 184 electoral votes, 1 less than a majority. Democratic House and a Republican Senate unable to agree on who should decide which sets of contested electors should be counted. In January 1877, Congress, under the guidance of President Grant, established a 15-member commission with 5 members chosen by the Senate, 5 by the House, 5 by the Supreme Court, and it was expected that the tie vote, both houses would nominate, in members of their own party, would be Supreme Court Justice David Davis, who had former Republican, a former Democrat who was counted as an independent, but then that got bollocksed up because the Illinois legislature elected him to the Senate. Remember that legislatures elected U.S. senators that year. And all the other Supreme Court justices were Republicans. So they appointed a guy named Joseph P. Bradley, and commission met, took action on March 2nd, 2 days before the inauguration, and guess what? Joseph P. Bradley voted with his fellow Republicans to give Hayes a 185-184 electoral vote victory. My own view is that the Democrats probably stole or suppressed a whole lot of votes by black voters in those 3 states, and they should have gotten those electoral votes, but the fact is hard as it may be believed, there's some that have observed that I've grown older over the years. I wasn't there at the time, or any time shortly there afterwards, and I don't really have first-rate evidence. In any event, President Hayes ordered the withdrawal of federal troops from the South. So it was counted as the end of Reconstruction, federal efforts to enforce equal rights for blacks. For many years, historians criticized Reconstruction. A lot of the accounts of it were written by Southern whites who were totally unsympathetic with the idea that blacks should have equal rights. Some of it was written by kind of the northern chattering class that thought that the Republicans who were supporters of the stalwarts and everything were kind of lower class political thugs who were using blacks as their agents or something like that. Not our kind, not the kind of people we know in our clubs, and so forth. And so Reconstruction, until I was an undergraduate in the 1960s, had a very bad press and a very bad background in academia. I think it's an effort that I certainly regard much more sympathetically today, although I'm not sure that it could have prevailed in the country as in light of what was opinion at the time. In any case, those are the bare-bone political facts of the 1876 election. Let me make 3 points about their significance. The first is that this election was an exemplar, and perhaps the high point, of a two-party political system that featured robust competition and bitter opposition. Does that sound familiar to anybody? It's sometimes spoken of by well-meaning observers, the high-minded, great, and the good, that high turnout is evidence of high satisfaction of the system, of general amity and consensus among the public. My observation is that high turnout is not because voters love each other, but more because they hate each other, or something like that, that they have serious and major disagreements about public policy and so forth, and fear of the consequences of other side's victory can bring out voters in unusually large numbers. We saw 81% of eligibles voted were recorded as voting in 1876. By way of comparison, in 2020, 66% of eligibles are reported to have been voted. That was a jump and a step increase. It was the largest percentage of eligibles that have voted in an election since 1900. So we're living in a time in a way that resembles the 1870s and the 1880s. We're moving back towards that idea of almost universal voter turnout. We hear charges that some of the laws passed by Republican legislatures are suppressing votes. If that's true, they're doing a very bad job of it. The voting is bigger in larger numbers than any other time in my lifetime, which goes back a ways. The historian John Greenspan has aptly named his book on this era's politics, The Age of Acrimony. It's a very interesting book by a historian that's steeped in the popular culture of 19th century politics and presents it in a vivid way. I reviewed it for the Wall Street Journal very favorably. And one reason was obviously the two parties' very different attitudes towards the Civil War. I mean, the Democrats opposed it. Of course, many were Southern Democrats, opposed it, fought on the side of the Confederacy in many cases. They opposed the abolition of slavery, and many supported the terrorism of the Ku Klux Klan after the war. The Republicans, founded in 1854, and at least by one tradition in the neighboring city or town of Jackson, Michigan, not very many miles away from us here in Hillsdale, to oppose slavery in the territories. They won the 1860 election with 40% of the national popular vote. The multiple candidacies in the North and the South. Lincoln, the Republican candidate, actually got 54% of the popular vote in the free states and won almost every single electoral vote in them, which was a majority of the electoral votes, reflecting the population in 1850 census. Lincoln got only 2% of the vote in slave states. Basically, the Republican Party didn't hand out ballots at a time when voters voted with ballots that were created not by the government but handed to them by the parties, and so forth. My interpretation, by 1874, Reconstruction policy was pretty clearly not supported by most voters. They didn't want to send troops in the South for reasons that some people might think resemble the reasons why many voters don't want to send troops to Afghanistan. And the support for Grant's and the big victory of the Democrats in the 1874-75 elections off year signaled that. But partisan acrimony predated and postdated the war and Reconstruction. The spoils system, awarding thousands of federal jobs to party activists, was instituted by the Democratic Party, President Andrew Jackson in the 1830s. It was imitated robustly by the first Republican president, Abraham Lincoln, in the 1860s and by Ulysses S. Grant and the stalwarts in the 1870s. Political rallies became a kind of male bonding sport, with throngs brandishing their ballots, provided, as I said, by the parties. Young men casting their first vote, they were called virgin voters. People would cheer on these 21 and 22-year-olds. Young women would watch them vote for their first, holding their Republican ballot up or their Democratic ballot up and casting their first vote. Greenspan provides a vivid description of the vast, stomping political campaigns that dominated popular culture. Men in big cities and courthouse towns would light stinking oil torches, don shimmering uniforms, burn effigies, roll floats, push coffins with the name of rival public politicians, sing serenades, build bonfires, light fireworks. I don't know if I think that you heard from Republican Party officials in Hillsdale County about this. I'm not sure that the Republican Party or the Democratic Party, which is in the minority in this kind, has been producing anything like this kind of politicking lately. As we see today, followers of each party develop an enthusiasm for its stands, even on peripheral issues. I think it's sort of like if you root for the Detroit Lions, you're going to root for the Lions, even though if you took an objective view, you'd say, gee, they just didn't really play good ball that year and they didn't deserve to win. If you're a big fan, you don't take that view. And the Democrats stood for low tariffs, Republicans for high tariffs to incubate infant industries. Democrats favored state autonomy on issues of slavery and race. Republicans favored using federal power to cabin in slavery. Republicans opposed Democrats opposed to Republicans favored subsidies for Western railroads, homestead laws with cheap land, grants for agricultural college. The activist government, relatively activist government of the Republican Party also resulted in charges of corruption and favoritism, which were used by the Democrats against the Grant administration and the Republican Party. And so you had one closely contested election after another, something we should be familiar with in as much as the last two presidential elections were decided by electoral votes determined by 77,000 and 42,000 popular votes out of 137 million cast and 158 million cast. Grant's reelection with 56% of the popular vote was the highest percentage for a presidential candidate. That was in 1872. Between Andrew Jackson in 1828, equaled by Theodore Roosevelt in 1904, not surpassed until Warren Harding in 1920. No presidential candidate of either party exceeded Tilden's 51% between 1876 and 1896. They were all operating in that very narrow range and hoping they could snatch the electoral votes of New York, Ohio, and Indiana by some narrow margin and get elected in that way. So the figure, why did the percentage of voter participation decline after 1876 to the point where it actually got below 50% in the 1920s when women were enfranchised, but many eligible women didn't vote for a variety of reasons? One reason is the disenfranchisement of black voters in the South, which started in the 1880s, 70s and 80s, and proceeded. It took some time to do, and so the fact is that South Carolina cast more votes in 1872 than in 1944. Poll taxes and other mechanisms to keep black voters, including force and violence and murder on occasion. Second reason is the passage of the civil service laws. including the Pendleton Act 1883 after President Garfield was assassinated. That meant the parties had fewer jobs to give out, and therefore a little more harder to get people in those torchlight parades. The third was the introduction between 1888 and 1891 of the so-called Australian ballot, ballots printed by the government. The parties didn't print them anymore. You printed them. It was easier to split tickets. It was more difficult for party people to make sure that this guy was going to vote Republican because you gave him a Republican ballot and he didn't come into the polling place with anything else. And so we saw some of the demise of that politics of enthusiasm. Politics became a little more high-toned, a little less of a mob activity. And that leads to my second point, which is 1876 tended to set the parameters for public policy in a period that extended well into the 20th century. If you just look at the list of presidents, you say, oh, hey, the Republicans won almost all the time. Between 1860 and 1912, you just had Grover Cleveland winning a couple of non-consecutive terms. But as the tenuous of the Republican victory in 1876 suggests, that's a misleading picture. Democrats held majorities in the House of 16 in the 20 years between 1874 and 94, just as Democrats won popular votes for pluralities in all but one election between 1876 and 1892. You could argue that the Republicans were maybe the weaker of the two parties and were, desperate to try and somehow maintain the majorities that they'd managed to win in the Civil War. Republicans tended to hold majorities in the Senate. So we had divided government. Once again, that sounds familiar, doesn't it? We've had divided governments for 68% of the time since 1968 election, and even more so in recent years. The Democrats have had 2 years of control, the trifecta, President, Senate, House, starting in 1992 and 2008, and once again in 2020. They lost the first two of those majorities instantly in the next off-year election. We'll see what happens to them in 2022. And you had that period. You also have the parties. The parties don't do bipartisan compromise there. Why would you do it if you thought, gee, the next presidential election, we have a real good chance of winning the president, the Senate, and the House. We can get all of what we want. So let's not compromise now. Skip the half a loaf. We'll wait till we fully take power. And that's how the parties participated. That's why tariff policy remains the same, mostly through this period, the high tariff, because the Democratic Party didn't get a trifecta until 1892. And so they weren't able to do so. So that's the Democratic Party in that way was kind of the party of, the historian Robert Kelly makes the argument the Democratic Party was like the Liberal Party in England of William Gladstone. It was a party that believed in free trade, relatively speaking. It was a party that believed in not a very active government, less government spending than the Republicans. It was a party that believed in local custom. You could have the saloon in the north and segregation in the south. We don't care, like Stephen Douglas, nationally, we don't care, let popular sovereignty prevail. And it was a party that was also hurt by ethnic or regional schism. The Civil War hurt the Democrats. And the issue of home rule for Ireland hurt Gladstone's Liberals in Britain. So in time also, the tariff issue hurt the Republicans because it becomes an issue. By 1900, America's infant industries have grown up. We're the #1 steel producer in the world in 1900. USA is pretty big stuff. The infant industries are not just teenagers, but they're big strapping adults. And the tariff becomes an embarrassment for the Republicans up to the point of the Smoot-Hawley tariff in 1930, which is why and large given credit for causing the Great Depression, or at least a major part of it. Hard money, the Democrats tended to believe in that. Andrew Jackson didn't think bank. He didn't like banknotes being used for money, just gold and silver, specie. And the hard money, it's interesting that in 1896, the Democrats totally turn on hard money policy, nominate William Jennings Bryan on an inflationary platform of free silver and so forth. They do very well in the West in the mining districts on that, but they get clobbered in the East and the Midwest. They lose votes that they never, and lose states that they had carried or were on the verge of carrying in the East and the Midwest in that 1870s and 80s period. It's a hard money country. Inflation is not winning politics in the United States. Let me go on to my third major point, that the campaign was not just the end of equal rights for blacks in the South, it was also the beginning of a huge separation of North and South, culturally and demographically as well as politically, that lasted basically most of the time between the Civil War and World War II, 75 years, 3 generations. The end of Reconstruction was a policy even in trouble even before the election of 1876. 1876 abandoned the kind of high-minded intellectuals in the Republican Party and the Southern-oriented apologists in the Democratic Party all say Reconstruction is terrible. The Supreme Court Republican nominees weakened the civil rights laws that the Reconstruction Congresses had passed, and so basically, what happens, I think, is that in the North, Northerners look away avert their gaze from the South. That system of segregation and the cultural mores that it fostered are just something that Northerners don't know about. And it's, the North develops this strong economy. Wages are double in the North what they were in the South. And yet, so the economic there is enough to attract 30 million people from Europe, come across the ocean, go through and certify their health to the immigration authorities. They immigrate to the northern states. Only 1 million Southern blacks and 1 million Southern whites during that period moved north. It's as if there was a Berlin Wall across the Potomac and the Ohio rivers, keeping America in 2 separate countries that don't pay much attention to each other. Only a few Republicans speak out for civil rights. Congressman Henry Cabot Lodge for Force Act, for putting military troops back there. He calls for that in 1890. The Republican majority say, well, let's do these other issues first, and maybe we'll get to that later. They never got to it. Congressman Leonidas Dyer of St. Louis, 1918, proposes a federal anti-lynching law. There were dozens of lynchings every year in the South. That goes nowhere, and the Democrats filibuster at the Senate. President Warren Harding made a speech supporting equal rights for blacks in Birmingham, Alabama in 1921. The chattering class of historians has denigrated Harding as a fool and a corrupt thing. I think he deserves better just for that one speech, as well as for other activities that he made. So you had 2 northern groups. One of the fascinating things to me was that the sociologist John Dollard, an anthropologist, he spent 6 months in Indianola, Mississippi. And in 1938, he publishes a book called Caste and Class in a Southern Town that talks about how blacks, when they called on a white person's house, had to come to the back door, how they were addressed by their first name and not ever called Mr. or Mrs., how they were barred from voting and so forth. And he's treated like he's Margaret Mead reporting on the sexual habits of people in Samoa. This is another country. It said this is revealing things that nobody knew anything about. 1938, and so forth. It's reviewed in that way. Well, every 10-year-old in Indianola, Mississippi knew everything that was in that book, white or black. It was part of common knowledge in the South. The North just wasn't interested. I think World War II changes that. When you've got people dying, then the question is, why shouldn't they have equal rights? That becomes a powerful argument, and I could go through that history at great length and have treated it in some of my books. But that becomes a huge argument. You have huge numbers then, in part stimulated by the war and the war industries, military service. 1/3 of American blacks moved from south to north between 1940 and 65, just 25 years. And you have major civil rights legislation. But I'm getting ahead of the story, and I think one of the things I'm saying is that that 1876 election had long-term effects. I call 75 years pretty long-term for an election. And I think the kind of bottom line on this is that some of the lessons that well-meaning people, sort of, goo-goos teach are not right. We don't get high turnout just because everybody loves everybody. We get high turnout because we have genuine differences on issues. We don't get, we get results, one among other things, that inflationary policies are unpopular in this country, and that high tariff barriers are in danger of becoming unsustainable. I think that becomes a lesson of the offshoot of 1876. I think that one of the things, and this kind of reverberates off one of your speakers earlier spoke, like the election of 1800, unlike 1860, the election result was widely accepted in America. Perhaps partly because most people were tired of Reconstruction, it went away, and so forth. Both sides lived to fight again for another day in very close elections. I think that was a big difference from what it is now becoming clear, if it wasn't before, the effort to delegitimize the election of Donald Trump in 2016 by Hillary Clinton and her campaign. We've just seen indictments on that issue of lying to federal officials, by the hoax of Russian collusion. I think that this is a poison that's injected to our system that we did not see by close party losers like Richard Nixon in 1960, and I give him credit, Al Gore in 2000. Obviously, he wasn't happy with the result, but he didn't say it was a result of a hoax of colluding with our enemies. I think we've seen charges also from Donald Trump that I think are excessive. Others of you may disagree. But I think that the first order of business in terms of restoring respect for even close and unpleasant election results, it's the Democrats' task to admit, and the press, and the New York Times, the Washington Post, other people in the press that spread the Russian collusion hoax, which is as wrong as the Titus Popish plot of 1683 or 1681. It's their turn to acknowledge responsibility for spreading disrespect for our system and for the results of the system. And I guess I say one other thing, which is, I think of the Adam Smith comment in 1776, the year they published his Wealth of Nations, and he's talking about the possibility of Britain losing the 13 coastal North American colonies, and he says there's a lot of ruin in a country, and a country can still persevere. And I think this country still has a lot of reason to persevere. This country had many positive upsides and achievements, quite astonishing ones, since the election of 1876, and in spite of some of its lingering bad effects and reverberations, and that any particular election result should not be cause for despair. Let me conclude at that point and invite questions and comments.
Thank you, Mr. Barone. We now have time for some Q&A. If you have a question, please make your way to one of the microphones in the side aisles. This is a reminder that student questions are encouraged.
Thank you very much for your talk this evening. When you mentioned the Supreme Courts in the 1870s, I lived just a couple houses down from one of those Chief Justices, Morrison Remick Waite, and I was curious why the Republican Supreme Courts would start to weaken things like the Civil Rights Acts that were passed by the Republican Congresses in the 1860s.
Well, the answer is, it reminds me of what Communist Barney Frank said when a reporter, when he was disciplined by the House and stood before the House, and a reporter said, I'm curious how you feel about how you felt when you were disciplined before the House of Representatives, and Barney Frank said, you will remain curious. The answer is I just don't know the answer to your very good question. I need to study those Supreme Court cases, and I kind of glided over them in law school. I tried to read the slaughterhouse cases one time, and I never got very far. And so I suspect that in the Hillsdale audience, there are actually a number of people in this audience that can answer that question in a very intelligent, revealing, and well-informed way. Your speaker is not one of them, alas.
Yeah, I wonder if you could describe the 15 members of the commission that decided the election. I don't imagine they all voted, with pure Snow White intentions. I know there was a lot of horse trading on the to get to the outcome. I wonder if you could describe some of the, dirtier backwoods, backroom horse trading that occurred to get to that decision.
Well, they voted with the party. I think that. Sometimes we say, well, these people must be kind of intelligent or stupid or behaving like, they're instructed, trained animals to vote for the party. I think sometimes when you come to close questions, one of the things you see is that when there are positions that reasonable people can take on both sides, Democrats tend to take the position that favors the Democrats, and Republicans tend to take the position that favors Republicans. I would argue, I've had this argument with former Senator and Secretary of State John Kerry that was the case with the Clinton impeachment. He would have none of it. He said the Republicans are all just totally wrong and stupid and blah, blah, blah. No, I said, people could say in 1996 that Clinton had lied under oath to a federal court. That violates the president's constitutional duty to fairly execute the law. A reasonable person could vote for impeachment on that basis. The Democrats could say, look, what he was lying about, they would phrase that a little differently, and the subject matter of this was personal conduct that did not directly affect his conduct, official conduct, public policy, and therefore he should not be ejected from office. Well, I can see how a reasonable person can believe that. And how many people crossed party lines on the Clinton impeachment? Well, 4, I think it was, out of 535 members of Congress, a little higher than that in the Senate. So I think, these people were expected to and did vote partisan ways. The differences between the parties were very substantial in that period, as I think they are today, and more so than they were probably in 1996, in my view. And the expectation is that they would go they would vote party line, and the fact that David Davis ducked out of casting the visibly deciding vote is kind of an interesting commentary, and I would like to read and learn more about his conduct in doing that. But when you have a two-party politics, as we've had since 1791, and which we got despite the fact that the founding fathers thought parties were a bad idea and they really didn't like it, you will tend to get issues decided along those lines. And in periods where there's what I call periods of partisan polarized parity, like we have today, when each party is capable of getting a 49% plurality in a given election, and each party has a plausible chance at the next presidential election of getting the White House, the Senate majority, the House majority, you're going to get people behaving in a pretty partisan way, elected officials behaving in a partisan way, and it's unreasonable to expect anything else. Maybe it would be better if something else happened, but that's the way it's going to be. We're going to watch this unfold on the economic issues in the Congress in the next couple weeks.
Just wondering how you'd characterize the political parties in the late 1800s as far as their political philosophy, conservative, liberal, that kind of thing?
Well, definitely, those terms I think are kind of unhelpful. Where the Republicans favored more federal government control and spending, and the Democrats were more a localist party in the 19th century. That changes in the 20th century in a way in which Hillsdale scholars and Hillsdale audiences have, I think, a lot of familiarity. But that was the case in the 19th century. So the Democrats were localist. Saloon is okay in the North, segregation is okay in the South. Free trade, let's not have the government interfere much. The Republicans were saying, no, the government should do more to promote virtuous behavior. The government, equal rights for blacks was one, but not the only example. And the example of homesteading. Government should encourage property ownership. The government should encourage building of railroads across the country and uniting geographically, commercially the country. So those were differences there. So I try to describe them with some specificity and accurately as to the time we're concerned with.
Good evening. Something you mentioned during your lecture is that Democrats and Republicans alike were able to move beyond the election of '76 because they had that shared interest of ending Reconstruction. My question revolves around the current political climate. Do you see any commonalities between the Republican and Democratic Party right now that could be a shared common interest to stop concerns about election integrity in our current political climate? Or do you think it's going to be more of a just fighting until the next election atmosphere for a long time, given the drastic differences between
Well,
the
in
parties?
1876, one of the things you could say is that each party got a half a loaf. The Republicans kept the patronage jobs, and the Democrats got for sure the end of Reconstruction, which was probably going to happen anyway. So there was a reason where both sides got something they kind of really wanted for the time being. Today, I think one of the problems is the legitimacy problem. I think that Trump not accepting legitimacy in the 2020 election is a real problem and something that I think it does not serve the country well. I say that realizing I know people in the audience will disagree. I think that Hillary Clinton and her campaign's promotion of the Russian collusion hoax was even more blameworthy. And the actions of the press in upholding that are more blameworthy. You know, I remember being it was an American Enterprise Institute where I was a resident fellow, and Norm Ornstein was speaking, and he said, the fact that Trump so strongly denies the Russian collusion hoax shows he's guilty because he gets angry. Well, I said, Norm, I said, look, he had reason to get angry if the charge is untrue. He has reason to get angry if the charge is true. There's no probative value to the fact that he gets angry, except it tells you something about his personal character, that he lacks a certain amount of self-control. It doesn't tell you whether the Russian collusion hoax is true or false. And I don't think Norm ever actually had a good answer to that one. The two parties are not really trusting each other very much at all. And I think, you know, as I see it, maybe this is a partisan view, the Democratic Party is seeking these rather extreme policy goals in congressional legislation, try to package it all in the reconciliation bill and say it's all budget issue. Boy, that's really, you know, I think there's a serious risk that's a bridge too far and that it all collapses. But there's also a serious risk if it succeeds. I think that trying to build, if you compare what the George W. Bush administration did with almost identical congressional majorities in that period in early 2001, and then with losing by one vote the Senate in June of that year by a party switch. What the Bush administration did, rightly or wrongly, on its education bill, on its budget bills, on tax bills, was to seek Democratic support and to go some distance towards getting Democratic support on the theory that you didn't want to pass this stuff just 51-50 and 218 to 217, but you wanted to get bigger majorities, though you'd get less of a policy victory. This crowd has taken a different view of what's doing that, and I think have increased the risk of their not succeeding, but they've also increased the political cost to the country, maybe the policy cost, but also definitely the cost of legitimacy to the country if they do succeed.
One of the things I really like about your writing includes the Encyclopedia of American Politics. And with that in mind, are you familiar with the work of Colin Woodard in American Nations?
Colin Woodard?
Yeah.
Yeah, I reviewed, I thought it was not as good as my work, but it was pretty good. He comes at it with a little different, I think I reviewed that one for the Wall Street Journal too. Yeah, I mean, he does the thing about, my friend Joel Garrow did in Nine Nations of North America in the early 1980s, which is a similar book. One of his 9 nations is Quebec, by the way, which really is an odd duck and different from all of us, but I better not get into that. One of the things that I prepared some remarks about earlier this week was the old phrase, e pluribus unum, which Al Gore in a speech in Milwaukee, Wisconsin in January 1994 translated as from one many. He explained that America just had one culture for many years, but now we were multicultural in 1994, and we had this proliferation of people. Well, of course, what that says? That says something bad about the Latin instruction in St. Albans School. But it also just gets it totally upside down. I mean, think about the Constitution, and I think people here at Hillsdale think about the Constitution a lot. And one of the things that the framers of the Constitution knew was that the British seaboard colonies were a diverse lot. They were culturally diverse. They didn't have to read David Hackett Fisher's Albion Seed to find that out, although it's a great book for all of us to read, and he's not a conservative, it's a terrific book. But Massachusetts was founded by Calvinists, Virginia and South Carolina by Anglicans, Pennsylvania by Quakers, Maryland by Catholics. Well, does that sound like it's not diverse? And to our population, in whose living memory religious wars had killed hundreds of thousands and millions of people in Europe, including the British Isles, the English and civil wars, and fought out also in Scotland and Ireland. This is the world the founders knew. And what did they say? They said there will be no religious test for public office. Not true in England. There was a test till 1829. Not true almost anywhere in Europe. Maybe the Dutch Republic, maybe the Swiss Confederation didn't have it. What about, in the First Amendment, Congress shall pass no law regarding an establishment of religion. We weren't going to have arguments about what the main religion and the tax-supported religion was going to be by the federal government of the United States because it wasn't going to have one. It wasn't a good idea to get arguing about that because getting a 51-50 vote for one religion over another in a country where people had very divergent religious beliefs and their recent ancestors had fought wars over that belief was not one of God's great ideas. And they recognized that. You have, and at the same time, as that phrase indicates, although the Supreme Court didn't realize in the Everson case and others in the post-World War II period, the states could have religious establishments. Massachusetts had one till 1833, and you might argue with the way they vote today, they have one now, except it's kind of a secular religion. There's elements of Calvinism there, isn't there? Thou shalt have no fun on certain times of the week. Connecticut had established religion until 1818. I was researching this. I read that New Hampshire hadn't established religion until 1817, even though its license plates read "Live Free or Die." And even though the state of Massachusetts sued somebody that placed a Band-Aid over "Live Free or Die" so that nobody could read it, I thought that was really a little weird. But anyway, they knew it was culturally diverse, and they set up a loose federal thing that would be capable of defending the country with military force, that would be capable of taxing the country, that would be capable of raising money, as Hamilton says, to pay off a national debt and to establish credit so that the United States could borrow money in emergency and conduct a vigorous policy and to disestablish trade barriers between the states and through the countries, create a national marketplace. Oregon now says that they're not going to allow people to buy things from Texas or something. That's the liberal, really thoughtful position. They might take a look at the Constitution, I think. The Constitution was made for a diverse people. We were a diverse people then in ways that were very important and relevant to people. We have been a diverse country ever since. The picture of America, even in the 1950s, in that post-war period, and what I've called the mid-century moment, when you had that powerful universal media of radio, movies, television, and it seemed like there was just one white bread culture for everybody, wasn't quite as monocultural as it seems. Think about black Americans during that period. Think about a lot of different things. But it was also, that was an unusual period in American history. Al Gore, who was born in 1984, may perhaps be forgiven for thinking that the white bread America, supposedly white bread America of the 1950s was the norm throughout our history. But if you know anything about history and have reflected on it, and are not just winging a speech where you were called in to substitute for President Clinton, which was what Gore was doing in 1994, you realize that that was really not so, that we've always been a very diverse country in ways that have been very important to people, and that the federal structure, one reason, principled reason for opposing greater federal exertion of powers and economic spending and things of that nature, is that it may be better in a diverse country to leave greater regional and interstate variation so that people can choose. And, if, as the U-Haul statistics suggest, a lot of middle-class people are choosing Texas over California, well, we have internal migration, and even the state of Oregon can't prevent people from leaving. So, anyway, I've gone on at length, but I hope that's responsive to your question.
We have time for one more question.
Okay.
Fortunately, my question is very brief. You just said that Al Gore was born in 1984.
He was born in 1948. Oh, okay. No, well, of course, when was George Orwell's 1984 published? 1948, right? He inverted the number.
Please join me in thanking Mr. Barone.
Okay.